Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel on the future of public-private partnerships. My name is Ruth David. I'm a senior reporter and Deputy London Bureau Chief at Bloomberg News. Thank you all to my panelists for joining us. We're going to go around the room and do quick introductions before I jump into it. So Mushtaba Jaffer, over to you.
Yes, I'm Mushtaba Jaffer, Chairman and CEO of MJ Group.
Yes, my name is Saud Al-Atiyya. I am the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs at Ministry of Finance of Qatar.
Lu'ay Shurafa. I'm President and Managing Director for General Motors Africa and the Middle East.
I'm Mohammed Barakat, Managing Director for the U.S. Qatar Business Council in Washington, D.C.
I am Miguel Azevedo. I head the investment banking practice for Citi Group in Middle East and Africa.
I'm Bob Willen, Managing Director and Chairman for Carney in the Middle East and Africa region.
My name is Lena Sen, and I'm President and CEO of DCA Capital.
My name is Khalid Al-Mani'. I'm Executive Director of Business Finance at Qatar Development Bank.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Manish Vyas, and I'm the President of Tech Mahindra's Global Telecom business and CEO of the network business.
Thank you, everyone. Maybe I can start with Saud. You know, the World Bank research reports that infrastructure commitments in the Middle East and North Africa dropped 90% in 2021. His Excellency, the Emir, spoke today of how the situation in Qatar has been different thanks to the pilot project around PPP. Can you talk a little bit about what other foreign investors you expect to bring to the market and in what projects?
Yes, thank you very much. The PPP actually in Qatar, it is not new. We are practicing the PPP since the early 90s with the oil and gas history. So ExxonMobil, Total, all of these companies are practicing PPP in the oil and gas since the early 90s. But what we brought now is PPP in the social infrastructure, such as education, such as healthcare, such as other social infrastructure projects. Recently, we launched the PPP law in Qatar, and I was leading this exercise. I was the project manager for the PPP law, and we launched it in 2020. Also, at the same time, we launched a couple of projects, such as the public school, such as also two packages from the public school, and as well as some project in the healthcare sector. Now we are working also with the Ministry of Commerce, because the unit being established at the Ministry of Commerce to launch other projects in different sectors, such as hospitality, services, and the other.
So it seems like it's a much broader definition of PPP right now. Lena, if I can bring you in, the Middle East experience might be slightly different from the African experience. Can you talk a little bit around the market there and what have been the biggest challenges to attracting and retaining PPP?
Sure. When we look at the continent today, the African continent, despite the fact that it has been quite resilient during the pandemic, it has significantly been impacted, just like all of the other continents, by that crisis. And now, with the crisis, the war in Ukraine, the continent is facing even more challenges. And one of the biggest challenges, a sector that is really key for the development of that region, is infrastructure. Infrastructure in Africa is facing very difficult position. And in fact, the African Development Bank estimated that the African countries will have to invest between 130 billion to 170 billion by 2025 in order to meet their infrastructure needs. So PPPs have been playing a role, but need to continue to play a much bigger role in this situation. And but well-structured PPPs, that's really important. And PPPs accompanied with multi-stake players. So whether it's impact investors, whether even philanthropies, civil society, it has to be an ecosystem that accompany the PPPs to have a real impact in infrastructure projects in Africa.
And I want to come back to something His Excellency the Emir said in his address. He spoke of rich countries helping the poorer ones emerging from the pandemic. Khalid, if I can bring you in on this, is this something the Qatar Development Bank is looking to do more around? And in Qatar, are there some nations that you are focusing on in terms of extending this help?
Thank you, Ruth, for the question. Of course, I think Qatar has been historically involved in supporting other countries in their development needs, and I think there are many examples worldwide around this. In Qatar, there is an organization called the Qatar National Fund, which is basically focused on supporting and helping foreign countries. We at the Qatar Development Bank are more focused locally. So we really look at the opportunities of what the local enterprises can benefit from the public and private partnerships. We have several activities in this regard to support our local companies to benefit from the big and mega projects in Qatar, whether this is in the oil and gas or whether it's in the infrastructure of Qatar, which has seen significant development in the past 30, 40 years. But sometimes as well with fast growth, you miss the opportunity of promoting the small and medium enterprises because you're more focused on the large infrastructure projects. So this is our role mainly in the Qatar Development Bank, to keep an eye on the small and medium enterprises, make sure that they have opportunities within within Qatar to benefit from these large mega projects, and as well connecting the local enterprises with some of the projects that they can benefit from internationally. So exporting Qatari goods to the international markets. So as a Qatar Development Bank, we are more focused locally, Ruth, on the development of the local enterprise.
Got it. And just to come back to that Africa theme really briefly, Mujtaba, if I can bring you in. At one point of time, you were a small and medium enterprise. What government incentives have you found helped the most in building out your business, and what are the takeaways for PPP from that?
Thank you. As you know, I come from the sub-Saharan part of Africa, and typically when people talk about Africa, they talk about it as a continent, and really you need to separate it into three bands, which is the North African band, the sub-Saharan band, and the Southern band, because typically they all work in tandem with each other in terms of country-to-country relationships. But as far as East Africa is concerned, the Kenyan government has been extremely versatile and has really helped private enterprise invest in the private sector through tax incentives, through facilitations of various agreements between bilateral agencies. Like, for example, one of our biggest investors is Temasek, which is the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore. So we have that collide with a lot of private equity funds who came in to help us grow our business and to invest in infrastructure. And as you know, infrastructure is really a hyper capital intensive endeavor, as you probably see in Qatar as well. And they don't necessarily generate cash flows immediately. So getting long-term money is critical. And PPP is one of the avenues in which you would pursue that. So we've looked at PPP in the LNG business, for example, where we want to generate power, clean power for the country. Our country is heavily dependent on fuel oil for power generation. We have clean energy, we have hydro, but the problem with hydro, it's seasonal. We have geothermal. Again, there's only so much geothermal facilitations we have. So a lot of part of our country actually runs, and that holds true for the region, by the way, where fuel oil is the major generator to subsidize the clean fuels. So there, LNG plays a huge part. Again, the government in itself doesn't have the capital. As you know, with the pandemic, as you pointed out, we have maxed out our balance sheets. There's not so much more that we can borrow as a country. So the only way we can really pursue these clean fuel initiatives, road infrastructure, power generation, is through a diversified PPP setup. Now, what you said was so critical, the right PPP. The biggest problem we've had in our region is a lot of the PPPs have gone south simply because there have been one-sided transactions where individuals come in, make these deals, and it isn't right for the country. And then they fall apart, and it becomes such a mess to resurrect it. So you have lots of projects that started, fell. We had dam projects in Kenya that created huge fiascos because it was the wrong deal for the country. Money came in, the company went bankrupt in Italy, and suddenly we're sitting up with half-built dams in the country. So having the right PPP partner is key, and negotiating a deal that's win-win for the PPP negotiator and the government is vital and critical. And that's the way we can grow.
And on the right PPP partner and investor, I would like to bring Miguel in. One of the things that we've been discussing is, can you call investors that are coming into the capital market, especially when you're talking about privatizations, as part of a broader approach to PPP? Miguel, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing there, especially with some of the big Middle Eastern privatizations? And do you see that trend extending to Africa, or is all the money just coming into the Middle East?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And it's really two different situations. In the Middle East, we see, in terms of capital markets, which is where I come from, we see a lot of what I would call secondary PPPs, i.e. privatizing infrastructure projects, raising money, recycling the money to invest elsewhere. So that is possible because there is a developed capital market, there is an established market, and there is a level of credit rating that allows a lot of investors to come in. And this is both equity and a lot of debt. There's a lot of debt coming into those projects. Typically 80-20 or 75-25%. When it comes to Africa, where I would argue is far more needed, what is needed is primary PPPs or CapEx, if we want. There, the situation is a bit tougher. I think Kenya, with all its issues, is actually a relatively good example. I think there are other countries where in the last few years we haven't seen the right public policies, the right support for projects, and as Lena was saying, for the right PPPs. So a lot to be done. I think it will only get done the day the capital markets can come in, because the task is humongous and there's no capital available other than through the capital markets. And through the capital markets, you can get the pension funds and all that. Nowadays, everyone that does an infrastructure project wants to talk to a Canadian pension fund. If you talk to a Canadian pension fund about Africa, they will start rolling their eyes and say, not yet, but very, very interesting, but not yet. So that's the reality, but let's be hopeful and let's work together towards that.
Let's maybe bring in Mohammed on the point about Canadian pension funds. What about American companies and investors? Where are they focused when looking at this region and wanting to bring funds into PPP?
Thank you, Ruth. Well, for American investors, they'll invest wherever the money comes from. That's the expectation. So the focus in the Middle East, the Gulf, has been hot. I mean, specifically in the sectors that Mr. Saud mentioned, like the oil and gas has been historically a big thing coming in, but they're looking into infrastructure projects that started looking into the Gulf, the expanded MENA region as well. One of the issues that, that they face is mostly security and the stability in the region. So when they've been evaluating some of their investments, they do trust some countries economically, their ability to fulfill some of these promises and coming in as major partners or actually taking on most of these projects. But as we know, most of these PPP projects are long-term projects, 25, 30 years. And in many places, when they evaluate the region, there is always that risk on where is this going when when there's a lot of political instability. So that's kind of a hesitation when it comes to their investments in some of the Middle Eastern countries. That's why there's a shift towards the Gulf, where they know that the fulfillment of the fund, the availability of the fund, even injection of fund with the government coming to take over some of these projects has pushed them to engage there. We haven't seen yet major in the Gulf, and even some of the, I would say, the Sham region, like Jordan and well, now upcoming Syria, because they feel that the governments don't have the fund. There's major projects, but they don't trust the system where it's going to pay off or these projects won't fail, as in some other nations.
And Louis, I saw you nodding your head vigorously. What has General Motors' experience been investing in the region, and what are some of the key challenges?
To add to Mohammed's points on where we are looking at where are the opportunities. I mean, we see that there are opportunities. There is a lot of talk right now about importing manufacturing footprint to the region. I see a lot of competition, not inside the Gulf, within the Gulf states, but also North Africa as well. We're talking Morocco, we're talking Egypt, Saudi, the UAE. So there is, I would say, a healthy competition on this front. The other area where I see where it will provide a huge potential, in my opinion, is EV infrastructure. This is an area where it's still embryonic in this part of the region. Yeah, probably Dubai is ahead of the rest of the pack, but the way we see Saudi is coming very strong on this front, especially with the 2060 net zero. But also the vision for Riyadh is quite astonishing. I have to say, one area that is in our humble opinion of strategic importance for the governments to pay attention to is startups. We are searching the region for the right opportunities. We know that when we talk about PPP, there needs to be an element. I mean, we talk about conglomerates and big companies, but there is, in my opinion, an element for the entrepreneur to play part in contributing to the ambitious visions of this region. And the way we look at it is, these conglomerates cannot do the things that these entrepreneurs can do at an accelerated fashion. Plus, it will definitely help. I mean, you've got a youth population in this part of the world that is immense. Almost 50% of the population of this region is below the driving age. So, big potential on this part of the economy for this region.
And on your point of startups, I want to bring in Manish. India and China have been some of the markets that have put through some big tech startups that have become kind of global champions. Do you think there's some read across for markets in the GCC in terms of what more the governments can be doing to incentivize these companies? Because we've not really seen those kind of champions from the region here.
No, an excellent question. And I guess maybe the operative word sounds like is right. It is right for the country, right for the community. Clearly, it's going to be right for the region and right for the world. And we often say that, hey, we should learn from history. But long history is often forgotten. We should at least remember the short-term history. So let's look at what has happened over the last 2.5 years during the pandemic. The world came to a stop, a very momentary stop initially. And yet, immediately after that, not only did it hum again, but it actually moved very, very rapidly. The way the world continued to live, work, and play in spite of the human crisis, I think was very fascinating. So where am I going with this? One sector that I think does not get enough credit, I would say two sectors, one or one and a half, is the telecom and the tech sector. that does not get enough credit for what they do. More so the telecom sector. I mean, I can't imagine this same forum last year was virtual and was a very successful one. Amazing. I mean, I had a great experience there. It was made possible by not magic, but an engineering marvel by the way the networks are constructed globally. We serve about 90 countries across the world, both telecom and mainstream industries. And what we learned through the process is if the governments continue to participate in the process of innovation, both on the network and the connectivity and in software, I think it has, we're talking about returns on investments. I think the returns on these investments for the nations and for the world and for the region is pretty dramatic and very rapid. For example, a few days ago, I was in DC on a roundtable on wireless industry. But we also ended up talking about broadband. I mean, US has this Senate bill which basically makes $45 billion available for development, for access, for deployment of broadband networks. And while in that only a select few companies can participate because you need to be capable enough to take advantage of that. But the benefit of that eventually comes to startups in any part of the world, in Africa, in Middle East, in India, anywhere in the world where they can be connecting anybody from anywhere. Because what also has happened over the last 2 years is the trust quotient has gone significantly up in terms of where you can do work from and who can do the work for you, right, from a connectivity standpoint. This, I believe, is one of the greatest revolutionary movement that has got unleashed over the last 2 years. So hence, what the GCC countries and this region can benefit from if governments continue to invest and support more development of tech and telecom, I think is the process of innovation is essentially going to get even more expedited. And that's it. And I guess that spawns a whole host of activities in any sector, whether infrastructure, AI for good, for example, and besides anything where a consumer or an enterprise can benefit from. So my big, massive shout out is to the telco industry and big shout out to the governments for supporting. And this is happening everywhere. I just gave you the US example. I think it's happening everywhere. The governments are supporting and looking very openly how can they support this important sector, because food, shelter, and clothing are the 3 basic needs. I think it is technology and software as well is a very basic need now.
I think you'll find a lot of people agree with you on that one. But Bob, if I can bring you in, we've spoken a lot about the theory around it. What have been the challenges from a Middle East lens that you've seen in implementing and executing some of these very ambitious PPP projects?
Thank you, Ruth. I think first, as a global consulting firm, we have seen many aspects around this topic of PPPs, the future, the potential, some of the pitfalls as well. And I think with such a distinguished panel, already many of these have been put on the table. I think when you look at this region, and it's clear that the percentage of GDP that run through PPPs is actually lower than other parts of the world. That's a clear sign that there's more potential, we'd like to say, or there's more development which is needed. I think what we see is that, and I think Lena raised the point of the ecosystem. The idea might be right, but the ecosystem has to be prepared in order to execute well a PPP. I think we're still in the state where the promise of PPPs has never been more clear. We need it, I think, in order to drive development in different ways. We're very excited to see some of the social infrastructure projects that are starting to come onto the table. Yet the ecosystem has to be ready. That means the regulatory environment has to be right. There needs to be clarity as to the incentives and some alignment of the incentives. There has to be a financial system which creates and supports those opportunities. There also needs to be a legal or judiciary system that helps to manage when things don't go perfectly, and it does happen. So a lot of that has to be in place in order to execute the projects well. And I think that's something which we're still seeing across this region. We're still seeing the development of all of that, which I think will enable even more projects to take place.
One of the other things unique about this region is many local companies are owned by big families. So if I can bring you in on one question that we had was, how do things play out if the PPP projects do not succeed? Does the government in that instance inject rescue funds, or how do they proceed?
I just want to clarify something here. The government of Qatar, they proceed with the PPP and they developed the framework of the PPP not for the sake of the fiscal and financial issues, because in the past, as a government, we did everything by our budget, by our fiscal policy. The idea here is how to bring high innovation, how to actually develop the private sector in Qatar to attract more FDI, and as well as, back to your question, to develop the family businesses here in Qatar. This is why we identified so many tools to do that. For example, as my colleague Khaled here mentioned about the mandate and the role and the responsibility of the Qatar Development Bank, which is to enhance, to improve the private sector role in the public projects. So it is not about that we are doing this is for a budget point of view, but we are doing the PPP to improve and to enhance the private sector in Qatar.
Which is a great position to be in, and many of your neighboring countries are not in that position. Lina, if we can talk a little bit about how do you get investors to come into the market, and how do you incentivize them to stay in the market? Because for Africa, you need it also for fiscal purposes, not just to develop the companies. And then do you work around creating a level playing field for both the local and the foreign companies? Or do you give the local companies a little edge because they need to be developed more?
Sure, thanks for the question. I think it's everyone knows that the African continent, and I'm speaking generally, but obviously there's a difference between the region. But the perception is negative, generally speaking. But these last few years, we've definitely seen growing interest on the continent, in the different regions, and rightfully so. I think the resources are there. We have young population. We have countries that are stable, and we can't lump them all in one category. So people see the difference and they see the opportunities. So it's not as difficult to approach investors and tell them, look, here's a market, here's an opportunity. You're interested in the telecom sector, you're interested in innovative sectors, technology. You have the opportunity to put your capital to work and accompany you. And I think I'm very optimistic. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, obviously things have slowed down. But we're definitely seeing renewed interest for instance, in a country like Senegal, where I'm from, with the new discoveries of oil and gas, for instance. There's all of a sudden very big focus and interest from investors from all over. So it is challenging. But we also see now that our governments realize that they have to play their role in terms of enabling an environment that reassures the investors. If they want capital to come in, they have to do their part. And I think we're seeing examples of changes in the way the environments are being put in place to attract more capital.
And Khalid, I had a question in terms of we're seeing so much of the geopolitical uncertainty right now, not just in Europe with the war, but also the situation in China for foreign investors. Are you seeing a more interest in coming into the Middle East from global investors, and what particular sectors are you seeing them more focused in?
So in principle, I'd say the answer is yes. I see, especially after the pandemic, things became clearer to us, at least in the bank, that there is more interest in Qatar. We've seen a big spike coming up into the applications for new projects. And these have came from several areas. Of course, in Qatar, I think the proposition for industry is also very strong because of the availability of land, the location of the country, the port, the availability of funding. So there is strong, I think, emphasis on industrial interest in the country. Honestly, I don't think the whatever is happening in Ukraine has too much effect on the interest of business in Qatar. I haven't seen a significant impact of that locally. Maybe it happens more in other areas or other jurisdictions around the world. But for us in Qatar, I think it has been, I think we weathered this. If this has been a global challenge, I think that has not had that much of an impact as did with COVID. And even before that, we had, of course, the political situation with our neighbors, which also had some change of, I guess, plans for the country in terms of, our approach towards supporting what kind of industries. In 2017, when we had the situation, we would focused a lot on food security and trying to make Qatar more food security in terms of its food and its needs for the local population and as well for the local businesses. Going into COVID, of course, we worked hard to make sure that the supply chains after the disruptions from COVID were met through by government intervention or through utilizing whatever relationships we had with some of our friends around the region. I guess, but one of the topics, if you don't mind, Ruth, I'd like to highlight as well here is I think in the region as a whole, if I take the GCC, there is an area that I feel still needs a lot of focus, which is the venture capital and the private investments. I think governments have played a strong role in providing the lending through the development banks or through partnerships, perhaps with some of the local entities. But I think the venture capital still has a lot to gain or a lot to give. If you compare us to other regions around the world, we've seen there is a big gap between investments received for local enterprises versus investments received, for example, in places like Europe or the United States. And perhaps I turn as well to companies like General Motors or General Electric or the oil and gas companies who do focus sometimes on these startups and provide these venture capital to the startups. So I think this is perhaps an area that the region needs. And I think that they will find a lot of support through the local development institutions and perhaps even people like, Mohammed Barakat and what they're doing with the connecting, the businesses between two countries. So I think that's an area I think that we need to focus on.
Absolutely, and maybe I can bring Miguel, the investment banker, in onto why more venture capital firms are not coming into the Middle East to invest and what can be done to encourage them to.
No, it's a process. It takes time. It is starting to flow. If you look in the GCC, you do have a few companies now that are worth 500 million plus, even $1 billion plus. This company started here, and I'm extremely confident that in the next 12 to 18 months, you will have an IPO of a tech company in the region, whether it is in Saudi or the UAE. I have to admit that I know a little less about Qatar myself, but it's happening. The region has more important or equally important to capital is attracting human resources. And the region has generated, has attracted, and has maintained more human resources in the last 24 months because the whole of COVID, the whole ability of being based here and running a global business, I think it changed dramatically, and I'm actually very, very positive about that. So a tech IPO in the next 12 months is my bet.
Mohammed, would you like to weigh in on what's stopping the North American venture capital firms from putting more money in? And what more can be done to bring them?
Well, I think there's so many people here that they can cover the venture capital more than me. But one thing I would say that actually is developing in this region, specifically in the Gulf region, that they can utilize more to attract PPP, but not just into their own countries. A lot of these nations, we were talking about that earlier at some point, are investing or donating a lot of cash towards rebuilding mega projects in different countries, either in Africa or even in upcoming Syria, in Iraq. And a lot of these projects require partners to build it. So to advance, as I would mention, to advance these local companies, allowing this cash to be partially spent in local partnership with their own companies to do and execute these projects in different other countries, that one will remove a little bit the sensitivity of family-owned in-country execution of mega projects, but also allow the country to benefit twice, where the cash is injected. Let's say a country donates $1 billion, as the US do when we do US assistance overseas, allow our American companies, in this case, their own companies, in let's say Qatar, to execute some of these projects, become a partner in these projects. It is a PPP project between a donor, a nation, and a private sector executor. That will encourage more companies to gain the experience, gain the knowledge, potentially gain more potential other investments from overseas, from American companies, from international companies that are willing to inject fund to a certain point that develop the experience because they don't yet have it. It's a new experience that's developing when it comes to the public-private investment. As you mentioned, there's a lot of injection of fund, but the region is developing. They're reaching out beyond their own borders. So that will allow them to gain that experience, be exposed more to international funds.
Yeah, can I add to this as well? Just from where I sit, I believe that I can bring two reasons back to your question. One is there is international competition for where you want to allocate the capital. So when I sit and discuss, for example, an opportunity in this region, I'm competing with the US, I'm competing with Silicon Valley, I'm competing with Europe, I'm competing with China. Okay, so there is this element of competition of where you're going to allocate that capital, and we need to see a good reason, a good return on capital for this money. So there is competition. That's one. Two, I think that as a region, and this is where I think another big opportunity for PPPs is on education, because a lot of these ideas and a lot of these neighborhoods, technology neighborhoods, innovation hubs happen around universities, and reputable universities. So education is key, in my opinion. And I've interacted with a couple of, incredibly, sound and solid universities here in the region. They are upcoming. To Miguel's point, it's a process. And I truly believe that education, investing in education, and universities, and a system to breed future entrepreneurs, that are, with technology, what's happening right now with technology is truly key. And I, as I said, we sit on a treasure in this region, the youth. Okay, the youth is a treasure, and if we are able to mobilize them, educate them, prepare them, they will prosper and they will carry this region. I just wanna go back to a point on the family businesses. You look at the family businesses here in this part of the world. At some point, they were startups, right? I mean, they were startups. They started to grow, one business at a time. Okay, so they need to do the same. I think that family businesses owe it to the community and owe it to the economic engine to look for these startups, because the model is there. I mean, you need to be, this is your business, you've done it, this is the business model that you've operated for years. A lot of things are happening, outside your comfort zone. You need to be, investing in these new ideas and the family businesses. So what's that next big idea? Okay, so this process, in my opinion, will generate that new generation of entrepreneurs in this region that will contribute to the many ambitions and to the many visions that we see in this region.
And Mujtaba, as a family business, are you all doing these kind of partnerships with smaller companies to help them with the education, with the know-how? And if not, what's stopping you?
Thank you, Ruth. So I just want to highlight a point that you raised. In our part of the world, we have a paradigm issue. On one hand, we have a highly literate population, extremely tech savvy. We have Mike Zuckerberg flying to our country to understand how money transfer works on mobile. Just to explain, we have the highest number of tech startups in our region. But the problem we're having is sourcing capital. Now that is another double-edged sword, because you have venture capital funds and you have private equity who are sourcing money from developed markets like the US and Europe. They want to bring in money to our continent, but they expect a return, right? A risk-related return, which is typically higher than you'd expect in the US and Europe, right? Now the problem is, you are a VC fund, you have a tech opportunity sitting in the US and Silicon Valley. It's $100 million investment. They put in $30 million and lever it up, right? So the net return when they get out of the investment is much higher than you would do in Africa, because there's not so much debt available to lever up a business, right? So you have two problems. You have technology savvy people who the first thing they want to do is get a job in America or in Europe, because there isn't enough opportunities. I think India's used to go through that, not anymore, right? So now the government's oppressed. We have all these amazing talent, right? But how do we keep them? Go to Dubai today, I assure you, every hotel and every major tech company has a Kenyan, guaranteed, right? Why is that? Because we can't hold on to them. We can't hold on to them because we source capital. We can't get capital because they're expecting higher returns, obviously, because of Africa risk, right? Or development risk. And the second problem is private equity do not see an exit. Because typically in Europe and in America, exit is IPOing. Our markets are highly illiquid, right? We're going through an election cycle, just an example, okay? August, we're having an election. 65% of foreign investment into the stock exchange has evaporated. Why? Everybody's worried about what's going to happen post-election. So this is the biggest problem our continent is facing, continuity. We go through this cycle, this 5-7 year election cycle, and it just, for example, in India, it doesn't matter who the prime minister is. The government goes on, right? This is our biggest problem on our continent, continuity of government regardless on who the leader is. So that's the problem we are facing. Yeah.
Continuity of government. I will not get into the India issue right now. That's a whole other debate. But
absolutely.
Maybe Manish, we could bring you in on what incentives you would like to see from governments in the region for companies like Tech Mahindra to invest more, and also to help with the know-how and partnerships that we've been discussing.
But I will bring it back to India. But in a different context, though, to your question, I think some excellent points made by earlier on education and by Mustafa on the talent aspect as well. I think there's an amazing story that happened and we contributed to it. India changed its monetary policy, if you recall, a few years ago, dramatically. A lot of criticism with that. I still don't want to comment on it, but what I do want to comment on it is what happened after that. Is the entire a massive unorganized sector, retail segment, suddenly became highly organized with one thing, and that's digital money. And guess what? I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of that we learned from Africa. We own one company which has actually been doing mobile money transactions in Africa partnering with the African telcos for years now, way before this was even a norm in any part of the West or India or even China for that matter. And Africa started from there. So the new tech stack that got built in India, I think has so dramatically changed how transactions are done. I, for one, when I travel back to India these days, I live in the US, I cannot use a currency note to pay to a driver. I can't even use a credit card. They absolutely flat out refuse, saying, sorry, sir, do you have a digital payment mechanism, a Google Pay, a Paytm, or some other pay? That's something that has happened. That's something which is clearly a brilliant gold standard example of public-private partnership on how it democratically, dramatically change how education can be consumed, how economy can be changed, how transactions can happen, and more importantly, how even the brain drain can be stopped. Because a lot of the innovation, the tech stack happened by the local startup and local companies like ourselves in contributing towards that. It's an open source based stack. Everybody contributed to it, and over a period of time, it just got developed to a fashion where everything happens on a barcode now.
Absolutely. That is a very interesting example. And maybe if I can we've got not a lot of time left, if I can bring it back to the macro and talk a little bit about the disruptions in the energy and the technology sectors that are underway globally, but especially what we're seeing in Europe. Bob, do you have any research and insights onto what markets in the GCC are the best positioned to attract investments and where you think things are going to get a lot harder?
Well, I think it probably start by saying the disruption right now really across the world in the global value chains in almost all industries is undergoing dramatic transformation, or at least a need for it. Not only is it the war in Russia and Ukraine, but I think you also see tremendous pressures on sustainability and ESG priorities taking place. You know, one could argue that that is also shortening supply chains. Not only is there risk in coming back from the disruptions of COVID, a supply shock or a demand shock of some kind, but also then the pressures of sustainability and ESG. So you see a lot, I'd say, in under pressure right now within, what we thought of as globalization in years gone by. I think the immediate priority certainly has to be energy and energy transition. I think that's probably where there's the most severe flashpoints. I think you see it directly in how Europe is reacting and thinking about not only how do they get through the coming months, but how do they get through next winter. That's probably where the real pressures will come to bear. And I think you're probably seeing a lot of interest in all forms of energy, but also with an eye towards future green energy solutions and sustainable solutions into the future. So I think in the near term, that's where we see probably still a lot of focus. It's inevitable, right? No matter what future you envision, we have to get through today. We have to get through tomorrow, and that requires energy. I go back to, and I think it's been brought up, I think the opportunity for this region continues to be in expanding the concepts of PPPs, looking forward in some of these other areas of social infrastructure. It's so important to the population. It's so important to the development of this region. It's so important to the world. So, again, maybe there's some short-term disruption or refocusing on energy, but hopefully that transitions into the many challenges that we all face for the future.
Thank you all for being here. It would be remiss to end this discussion without mentioning the amazing football stadium and the fact that we are all looking forward to maybe coming back for the cup. That is a great example of PPP. We look forward to being in touch. Thank you.